Hey everybody, this is Tao at The Forge, and this week I'm coming to you with the deck that I'm going to be playing for a little while here. This is called Howling Mine, and the first time I heard of it was on MTGGoldfish's channel. I've changed it a little bit, but it's mostly the same, so credit to Saffron Olive, better known as Seth, or lesser known as Seth, I suppose. Okay, so the point of Howling Mine is to do something that's really kind of weird, and that's to try and get your opponent to draw cards, right? And so you're drawing cards and your opponent's drawing cards, but then what we're going to do is punish them for having too many cards in their hand, and also kind of disrupt their play so that they just can't play anything. Right, so that's kind of the plan of this deck. It's kind of weird, and I think when most people see it, they're like, "Oh, well, I get to draw a lot of cards. That's really good." And usually it is, but it's kind of weird the way this deck goes. It just makes it really hard for your opponent to cast anything. So, anyways, let's get into it, and I'll show you how it works. So the finishers here are Ebony Owl Netsuke. So at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, that player has 7 more cards in hand. Ebony Owl Netsuke deals 4 damage to them. Okay, the other one we have is Fevered Visions. So Fevered Visions is at the beginning of the player's end step, so different. That player draws a card. If the player is your opponent and has 4 or more cards in hand, Fevered Visions deals 2 damage to him or her. So basically, those are the ways we're going to just nickel and dime our opponent down, just like either 4 at a time or 2 at a time, and slowly bring them down. Now, sometimes you can get like multiple Ebony Owls out, and you can like just devastate your opponent. You know, Fevered Visions, I'd say, is actually a very good include in this as well. Okay, but how are we going to get our opponent to have 7 cards in hand for Ebony Owl, or 5 or more cards for Fevered Visions? Well, we use cards like, well, first, Remand. So Remand we have as a counter, but it doesn't counter the spell and put it into the graveyard. It puts it back into their hand and replaces itself, so maybe we get another Remand or something like that. Right? So we can put the card back in our opponent's hand and basically make it difficult for them to cast it. Now, probably the worst thing you can do to your opponent is in these 8 cards here, Boomerang and Eye of Nowhere. They're essentially the same card. So you have return target permanent to its owner's hand. This one's a sorcery though. Boomerang's better because it's an instant, but they have the same mana cost as well. So basically what you're going to do with these is ideally you have it in your opening hand, and if you're on the play, you play like turn 1 island. Your opponent plays their land. If they're probably not going to play anything, or even if they do, it's not a huge deal. Turn 2, you play another island and boomerang them, right? And then what you do is you return their land back to their hand. So on your turn 2, at the end of turn 2 for you, your opponent won't have any land. And then they play that land again, and let's say they can't play anything, and then you have Eye of Nowhere. So on turn 3, you return that land back to their hand again. Right, and you could actually do this so that on turn 4 you have like 4 mana, and your opponent is still putting out their first land again. Right, so they just can't play anything, and then they have to start discarding to hand size because they can't play anything, and then you can start getting your Ebony Owl out. A lot of times people, I think, make the mistake of trying to get Ebony Owl out too early. But overall, it's pretty you're probably going to get it out on turn 3 or 4. Now, after that, we make our opponent draw lots of cards using Howling Mine. Okay, Howling Mine is awesome. So at the beginning of our draw steps, you just draw an extra card, right? So that's good for us because we are disrupting our opponent. And it keeps our disruption going, right? So we're rarely ever empty-handed, and we're always looking for counters and disruptions. So with Howling Mine, then that's a good way for us to keep our hand going, right? So we rarely ever just fizzle, right? Exhaustion's awesome. So when eventually our opponent's going to get something down, and they're going to attack with it, and then we can say creatures and lands target opponent controls don't untap during his or her next untap step. This is really good against a lot of token strategies. So they make a lot of tokens, and then you go and they attack you, and then the next turn they can't untap, and they just can't do anything again. Now, Blood Moon is just a killer for some decks. Some decks just play all non-basics, and by turning them all into mountains, then you can just really stop them from being able to play anything at all. Now, Simian Spirit Guide, I was a little bit unsure about this one at first, but it's actually pretty sweet. Right, so yeah, Simian Spirit Guide, it's a 2/2 for 3, but we never actually use that, or rarely anyways. We're going to use it to exile from your hand and add a red mana. I've actually been lucky enough to just wreck an opponent where I had an opening hand with like a Steam Vents and 2 Simian Spirit Guides, and then I was able to get the 3 red mana I needed to Blood Moon them on turn 1, and then our opponent literally just couldn't cast anything for the whole game. Right? I think they were looking for their basics, but they just couldn't find them, and yeah, it was just awful for them. Alright, Fevered Visions is kind of like like Howling Mine in a way. So at the beginning of your end step, that player draws a card. If the player's your opponent has 4 or more cards in hand, Fevered Vision deals 2 damage to them. Now, I like Fevered Visions late game because, well, what it does is that like you play it, and let's say you have 2 open mana, so like turn 5 or something like that, then you play Fevered Visions. At your end step, you draw a card, and very often you're going to draw like Boomerang or Remand or something like that. So it gives you that card at the end of your turn to kind of help. Now, the card I probably like the least in this deck is Temple Bell, but I think it's necessary. Temple Bell is basically a more expensive Howling Mine. So you can make it so each player draws a card, but you can do that whenever you want. So that's, that's pretty good. It's not the best. It'd be better if it were 2 mana, and then but I think that it's a necessary card. We have to have an additional way to get our opponent to draw cards. Alright, so going after that, we have Time Warp. Now, Time Warp, I was like, well, you know what? It's 5 mana, and, target player takes an extra turn after this one. So, so what, right? But you got to keep in mind, Time Warp can actually really save us. I was, again, really skeptical about this one. So let's say, we're stalling the game, and we're kind of just nickeling and diming our opponent down. So we are almost always going to go, late turns, unless we just get killed immediately. But at that time, we'll have, Howling Mines and Fevered Visions and stuff like that. So when I take an extra turn, I'm not just drawing an extra card, I'm actually probably drawing 2 or maybe 3 extra cards, and I get to untap my mana, and then often you'll get the second Time Warp after that, and then, or else you can get a bunch of Eyes of Nowheres or something like that, and you can just, it just helps you to recover from the game. Okay, lastly in the main board, we have Runeflare Trap. So after a while, you're going to get a Fevered Visions and a Howling Mine or something like that down. And so your opponent's going to draw 3 or more cards all the time in this game. So when you get Runeflare Trap, you can pay 1 red and just basically hit your opponent for the number of cards in their hand. So, let's say, they draw 3 or 4 cards, they're going to have 11 cards after their draw step. You stop, put a stop there, and then basically you can just one-shot them for almost half their life total if that's if they have that. So Runeflare Trap is actually a really sweet card to have in there. Now, in the sideboard, or not sideboard, and for lands, I've got 4 Flooded Strands. Now, a lot of people, when MTGGoldfish did this, I think he didn't have Flooded Strands. I forget what the name is. It's the red and blue one, fetch land. But you don't actually need that because all of your lands are islands, right? So pretty much all of them except for Minamo and Oboro, right? Those are all islands. So Flooded Strand is probably the cheapest fetch land. If it's not, just use the cheapest fetch land that can get islands. I just happen to have them already, so I was pleased to make that switch out. Okay, so we got 4 Flooded Strands, 4 Steam Vents, and and then Minamo and Oboro, and then we have again that's 10 cards, so we have 8 more islands. So we're only playing 18 lands. It's usually enough, especially if you can get a turn 2 Howling Mine or turn 1 Howling Mine. You're just drawing so many cards, you're going to draw into all your lands anyways. The reason why I'm playing Minamo and Oboro is just so that if our opponent has a choke, then they won't be able to choke you with this. So you can actually just get, because they're not islands. So you'd still be able to cast things, and you could maybe make a win out of it. All right, going into sideboard. So for sideboard, I was thinking, like, what are the worst things that that can happen to us? So one is that someone tries to destroy all our artifacts, so our temple bells, our howling mines, our ebony owls, right? So that's why we have Hurkyl's Recall. Right, so if our opponent has artifact destruction like that, we can return them all to our hand and then just play them out again. Another thing we can do is this, of course, works against Affinity and various other deck strategies. So, Hurkyl's Recall is good to include. It's an instant as well, which is nice. Green ramp decks are often difficult to deal with because it's harder to disrupt them. And often, like elves, for instance, and get like a million little elves out and stuff like that. So Hibernation is actually pretty sweet. Return all green permanents to their owner's hand, and like if you consider elves, they often have like 10 or 12 elves out on like turn 3 or 4. And this is an instant, so they all swing in. You just return them to their hand, and at the end of their turn, they've got to, discard them all, and then, then they're back up to their maximum hand size again, where you can just start punishing them with Ebony Owl. Again, we're really kind of weak against, like I found, against like strategies that have like tons of token creatures or tons of small like white weenies and stuff like that. So I put in a pair of Anger of the Gods and also a pair of Pyroclasms, just as a kind of form of board wipes. We have a third Blood Moon in case our opponent is playing something like Tron or something like that. We want Blood Moon to come more consistently. Against Planeswalkers and other assorted things, we have Pithing Needles. And probably, I think, our toughest match is against Burn, because Burn doesn't need very many lands, and putting cards in their hand, like the way you beat Burn typically is just to survive their initial onslaught, and they just fizzle, they run out of gas. But with Howling Mine, you're actually giving them tons and tons of cards, so they can just keep crushing you. So the idea with Burn is to stall them and stall them with Remands and Boomerangs and stuff like that until you can get a Witchbane Orb out. So Witchbane Orb enters the battlefield, destroy all curses attached to you, but mainly you have hexproof, and that's really what we want, is just get hexproof against them, and then it makes them a lot more difficult. It makes it a lot more difficult for them to attack you. If they do attack you, then you can go Eye of Nowhere or a Boomerang or return to their hand. You can exhaustion them out and stuff like that. So a couple things just to remind you of, a couple things I found. One is if you're playing an extra Blood Moon, just remember that Flooded Strand will come in with as a mountain, so it might be like basically you're going to change your land ratios quite a bit. If you have a chance to play either Flooded Strand or an other land, I would play Flooded Strand almost immediately and then crack it, even if you're just getting an island, because it thins your library. This deck really wants to just draw action all the time, so you don't really want to draw too many lands. All right. So after that, just a couple other things. If you can get a turn, let's say you had a choice between turn 1 Blood Moon or turn 1 Howling Mine. I guess it depends if you're just playing against like an unknown opponent. But I would almost certainly go for the Howling Mine, because the extra card draw that you're going to get is just really, really good. Like I said, if like let's say you're in game 2 or something and your opponent's playing all these non-basics or something, then yeah, Blood Moon's the way to go with that. But anyways, after that, that's pretty much it. We'll see how it goes. Like, my warning about this deck is there's going to be a lot of people who will flip the table on this one. They really don't like playing against this deck when it gets going. I think it's because it's kind of like Lantern Control in a way, where you can see things coming and you got all these great cards in your hand, you just can't seem to ever play them. People just get really frustrated. I seem to like a lot of these decks that play like this, where you're just kind of trolling your opponent. But it's frustrating, because a lot of times you're going to play and you'll beat your opponent turn 1, and then they'll just won't come back, right? They'll just you'll have to go to time on it, or they just scoop and tell you your deck is like a dumpster fire or something like that, and so it's funny, but it's also really annoying, because I'd say probably about 50% of the time, like, I don't complete all 3 games in the match, like, or even, I don't go, like, get win or 2 or whatever. Like, opponent just scoops, or they get really salty about it or whatever. So, that's a warning. If you do like playing that and, angering people or whatever and ruining people's days, then Howling Mine might be the deck for you. So anyways, that's it for now. Stay tuned for some gameplay videos that are coming up. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.